A scream pierces the frozen night as Eliza, abandoned and bleeding, clings to her newborn twins in the merciless 1875 wilderness. Betrayed by her cowardly husband and his outlaw gang, she faces death alone until a Comanche warrior, Tangua, haunted by his own scars, makes a choice that defies his vows. Their paths collide in a tale of survival and sacrifice, forging a bond stronger than blood. Will they find a home amidst hatred, or will the past tear them apart? Subscribe to uncover their fate. Share where you're listening from. Every tale deserves a listener. Curious? Stay until the end for a twist that redefines love. The wind howled like a wounded coyote, tearing through the pines in the winter of 1875, where the Wyoming wilderness stretched vast and unforgiving. Eliza's scream cut sharper than the cold, her voice raw as she clutched her swollen belly, one hand gripping the splintered edge of a wagon wheel. Mud and slush sprayed from the hooves of the outlaw gang's horses, their lanterns swinging like drunken fireflies as they thundered down the rutted trail. "Don't leave me," she cried, her words cracking against the night. But the men didn't look back. Her husband, that spineless gambler with a grin like a snake, sat among them, his eyes averted, his betrayal colder than the snow piling around her boots. "You're trouble, Eliza," the gang's leader, a man with a face carved from hate, had spat before cracking the reins. "Who gets pregnant in the middle of a heist? Die here or later, don't much care." Laughter, harsh and hollow, echoed as the wagon vanished between the black silhouettes of trees, its lantern light swallowed by the dusk. Eliza's knees buckled, slamming into the frozen earth. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one a knife in her chest. Blood seeped warm through her torn skirts, mixing with the snow, flurrying weakly from the sky. Contractions hit like a stampede, relentless, tearing through her core. She clawed at the ground, dragging herself toward a hollow log, her nails scraping frost and dirt. The forest offered no mercy, only silence, broken by her half-cursed prayers. Pain was a living thing now, coiling tighter with every heartbeat. Her hands tore at her skirts, teeth gritted against the scream clawing up her throat. Darkness pressed in, heavy as a grave, but her will burned hotter than any fire. She wouldn't die. Not yet. Not while her babies still fought to breathe. The first child came just past midnight, slick with blood, his cry thin but fierce, a spark in the void. Minutes later, the second followed, smaller, weaker, barely whimpering. Eliza's hands shook as she ripped flannel from her coat, wrapping the twins tight against her bare chest. Their warmth was her anchor, their tiny hearts thudding against her own. "You live," she whispered, her voice a cracked vow, lips brushing their fragile skulls. "You hear me? You live." Her eyes fluttered, vision blurring as the wind rattled the trees like bones. Snow dusted their swaddled forms, and she rocked them, her body trembling from cold and loss of blood. The world felt like it was closing in, the stars above hidden by clouds thick as despair. She didn't see the shadow watching from the cedars, didn't hear the soft crunch of moccasins in the snow. Tangua, son of a Comanche war chief, crouched motionless, his bow still across his lap, knife glinting at his hip. He'd been tracking the wagon, not for her, but for the men who'd slaughtered a merchant's camp near their water. A white woman birthing alone on Comanche land was no concern of his, or shouldn't have been. His mother's screams still haunted him, drowned by flames years ago. His brother's small hand, limp in his, was a weight he'd never shed. He'd sworn never to lift a finger for the invaders again. Yet the infant's cries, sharp and unknowing, clawed at something deeper than his hate. He rose, eyes cold as the frost, ready to turn away. But the weaker twin's whimper grew faint, lips blue-tinged, searching for air. Tangua cursed under his breath, the sound swallowed by the wind. He spun his horse, hooves kicking up snow, and dismounted beside her. Eliza flinched, barely able to lift her head, her voice a ghost of itself. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt them." He knelt, his shadow looming over the log. The twins' skin was pale as new bark, their breaths shallow. Eliza's pulse was faint but steady, her eyes fierce despite the fever in them. "Not for you," Tangua muttered in his tongue, low and rough. "For the ones who can't yet know hate." He pulled a hide blanket from his saddlebag, wrapping the infants first, their small bodies shivering against the warmth. Then he lifted Eliza, her weight nothing to his arms, though her blood stained his hands. She whimpered but didn't fight, too weak to resist. Snow crunched under his boots as he carried them toward the ridge, his face hard as stone, the moon climbing high above the pines. The wilderness watched, silent, as he vanished into the dark, with a woman no one wanted and 2 lives too young to choose sides. The wilderness watched, silent, as Tangua vanished into the dark, with a woman no one wanted and 2 lives too young to choose sides. His boots sank into the snow, each step a battle against the wind's bite, Eliza's weight heavy in his arms, her twins bundled against his chest. The moon hung low, its silver light carving shadows across the Wyoming ridge, guiding him to a crumbling fur trader's post, abandoned save for the ghosts of old pelts and broken dreams. The shack's timbers groaned under the storm's weight, but its walls held, a frail shield against the 1875 winter. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and decayed hides. Tangua kicked aside a splintered crate, laying Eliza on a bed of musty furs near a stone hearth. Her breaths were shallow, her face pale as the frost outside, but her eyes flickered with a stubborn spark. The twins, wrapped tight, stirred faintly, their whimpers like faint sparks in the gloom. Tangua's hands, calloused from years of bowstring and blade, worked swiftly, piling kindling in the hearth. Flint struck steel, sparks spitting until a fire coughed to life, its glow pushing back the cold. He glanced at Eliza, her lips moving in silent prayer, and felt the old vow, never to aid a white soul, twist like a knife in his gut. He'd tracked the outlaws for their blood, not to play savior. Their raid on the merchant camp had left bodies strewn like leaves, their greed tainting Comanche water. But these infants, their cries raw and untainted, weren't the enemy. Tangua pulled a water skin from his pack, dribbling drops onto the weaker twin's lips. The boy's chest heaved, a faint shudder of life. Eliza's hand twitched, reaching for her sons, but she was too weak to lift them. "They're alive," Tangua said, his voice low, accented, cutting through the crackle of the fire. "Rest, or you won't be." She nodded, eyes glassy but fierce, clinging to his words like a rope in a river. Tangua turned to the fire, feeding it sticks, his mind warring. His mother's face flashed, her screams swallowed by flames, her body broken by settlers' bullets. He'd been 16, helpless, watching his world burn. Now, here he was, saving one of them. He shook his head, jaw tight, and pulled a strip of dried venison from his satchel, placing it beside a bowl of steaming broth he'd warmed over the flames. "Eat," he said, not meeting her gaze, "or you're no use to them." Eliza's fingers trembled, grasping the bowl, the warmth stinging her frost-bitten hands. She sipped, the broth's heat spreading through her chest, grounding her. The shack creaked, wind clawing at the gaps in the walls. Outside, the storm howled, but the fire held steady, its light dancing on the twins' faces. Tangua knelt by the weaker boy, checking his breath, his fingers careful, almost tender, despite the scars crisscrossing his knuckles. "He's stronger," he muttered, more to himself than her. "Keep him close." She watched him, this warrior whose silence spoke louder than his words. Stories from her childhood painted Comanche as shadows of death. But this man, with his steady hands and unreadable eyes, was no monster. "Why?" she rasped, voice barely above a whisper. "Why help us?" Tangua's gaze flicked to her, then away, settling on the fire. "Not for you," he said, his tone hard but not cruel. "For them. They don't carry your sins." The words hung heavy, like smoke trapped in the rafters. Eliza's throat tightened, but she said nothing, her eyes drifting to her son's. The stronger twin squirmed, his tiny fist curling against the hide. Tangua rose, slinging his bow over his shoulder, and stepped toward the door. "Stay here," he said. "The outlaws might circle back." He paused, his silhouette framed by the doorway, snow swirling beyond. "If I don't return, head west at dawn. There's a stream. Follow it." "Where are you going?" she asked, fear sharpening her voice. He didn't answer, only pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the storm, the door thudding shut behind him. Eliza clutched her twins, the fire's warmth a fragile promise against the cold. She didn't know if he'd return, or if the outlaws would find them first. But as the flames crackled and the twins' breath steadied, she felt something shift, a thread of trust, thin as a spider's web, tying her to the warrior who'd chosen mercy over vengeance. Eliza clutched her twins, the fire's warmth a fragile promise against the cold. She didn't know if Tangua would return, or if the outlaws would find them first. But as the flames crackled and the twins' breaths steadied, she felt something shift, a thread of trust, thin as a spider's web, tying her to the warrior who'd chosen mercy over vengeance. Dawn broke weak and gray through the shack's warped boards, the Wyoming wind still gnashing at the walls in 1875. Eliza's eyes snapped open, her body aching like it had been dragged through a stampede. The twins slept against her, their tiny chests rising under the hide blanket, alive despite the night's cruelty. The shack was quiet, too quiet, save for the fire's dying hiss. Tangua was gone, his absence heavy as the rifle propped against the wall. Eliza's heart thudded. Had he left them to the wolves? Or worse, the men who'd abandoned her? She shifted, wincing as pain lanced through her ribs, and scanned the room. The broth bowl sat empty, the venison untouched. Her throat was dry as sagebrush, but fear kept her still. Then, a sound, hooves, slow and deliberate, crunching the snow outside. Not the reckless gallop of outlaws, but measured, like a predator circling. She grabbed the rifle, its weight foreign in her trembling hands. The door creaked open, and she raised the barrel, her pulse a war drum. A figure stepped in, broad-shouldered, cloaked in a buffalo hide dusted with snow. Tangua, his eyes, sharp as flint, flicked to the rifle, then to her face. "You'd miss," he said, voice low, almost amused. Eliza lowered the gun, shame burning her cheeks. "Thought you were them," she muttered, nodding toward the unseen trail. He grunted, setting a skinned rabbit by the hearth. "They're not here. Yet." He stoked the fire, sparks snapping like distant gunfire. Eliza watched, the rifle still in her lap, her mind wrestling with the stories she'd grown up on. Tales of Comanche raiders who left only blood and ash. Yet here was this man, feeding a fire to keep her sons alive. "You're not what they say," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Tangua's hands paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. "And you're not what I expected," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much. The morning dragged on, the shack a brittle refuge, Eliza fed the twins, her hands clumsy but steadying, the act grounding her in the face of uncertainty. Tangua worked in silence, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, its rhythmic scrape filling the space. Then, a new sound. Shouts, boots on snow, the clink of spurs. Eliza froze, her son's warmth suddenly fragile. Tangua was at the door in an instant, bow in hand, peering through a crack. "Rangers," he hissed, his voice a blade's edge. "Stay low." Through the gaps in the boards, Eliza glimpsed them. 4 men in dusters, rifles slung across their backs, badges glinting like vultures' eyes. One, with a beard like tangled wire, called out, "We know you're in there. Got word of a woman with outlaws. Come out, or we burn it down." Eliza's stomach churned. They thought she was one of them. A bandit's woman, not a victim. She clutched her twins, her voice a whisper. "They'll take me. Call me a whore." Tangua's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the bowstring. "They won't touch you," he said, the words a vow carved in stone. He stepped outside, bow lowered, but ready, his silhouette stark against the snow. "No outlaws here," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Just a woman and her children." The bearded ranger spat, his hand hovering near his pistol. "You're Comanche. Why shelter a white woman? Hand her over." Eliza's breath caught. She crawled to the door, rifle dragging, and stood, ignoring the pain screaming through her body. "He saved us!" she shouted, stepping into the light, her sons cradled tight. "My husband ran with thieves. Left me to die. This man didn't." The rangers exchanged glances, their hands twitching. The leader's eyes narrowed, weighing her words against the blood on her skirts. Tangua stood unmoving, a wall between her and their guns. "Walk away," Tangua said, his voice cold as the wind. "Or you don't walk at all." The rangers hesitated, the air thick with unspoken threats. Finally, the leader raised a hand, signaling retreat. "We'll be watching," he growled, mounting his horse. As their hooves faded, Eliza sank to her knees, the rifle clattering to the ground. Tangua turned, his eyes meeting hers, not soft, but steady, like a horizon after a storm. "You spoke for me," he said, surprise threading his words. Eliza nodded, her voice barely audible. "You saved us first." Tangua turned, his eyes meeting hers, not soft but steady, like a horizon after a storm. "You spoke for me," he said, surprise threading his words. Eliza nodded, her voice barely audible. "You saved us first." The Wyoming wind carried the rangers' hoofbeats into the distance, leaving the fur trader's shack steeped in a brittle quiet. The fire's embers glowed faintly, casting shadows across the 1875 snow-dusted floor. Eliza sank back against the furs, her twins' breaths a fragile rhythm against her chest, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind sharp with questions about the warrior who'd stood between her and death. Tangua crouched by the hearth, feeding it fresh wood, the flames licking up like hungry tongues. The shack's walls creaked, holding the cold at bay, but the space between them felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Eliza's fingers traced the hide blanket over her sons, her voice breaking the silence. "You could have let them take me," she said, eyes fixed on the fire. "Why risk your neck?" Tangua's hand stilled, the kindling untouched. He didn't look at her, his gaze lost in the flames. "I've seen enough taken," he said, his voice low, rough as gravel. "No more." She studied him, the scar across his jaw, the calluses on his hands, the weight in his eyes that spoke of more than battles. Her own past clawed at her, memories of a father who'd walked out when she was 6, leaving her with a mother who'd bet their last dime on cards. Her husband's betrayal, his coward's grin as he rode off with the outlaws, stung sharper than the cold. "My kin left me too," she said, the words spilling like blood from a fresh cut. "Father ran. Mother gambled me into hunger. Then that snake I married. He chose gold over us." Tangua's eyes flicked to her, sharp but not unkind. He set the kindling down, his fingers brushing the knife at his hip. "My brother was 10, he said, his voice steady but heavy, like a stone dropped in still water. "Cavalry burned our camp. He screamed for me, but I couldn't reach him. Fire took him, took my mother too." The words hung, raw and unpolished, the kind of truth that didn't need embellishment. Eliza's throat tightened, her hand pausing over her twins. Their losses weren't the same, but they were carved from the same blade. Abandonment, betrayal, the kind of pain that left scars deeper than skin. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling like stars into the shack's dim rafters. Eliza shifted, wincing as her ribs protested. "We're not so different," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Both left behind." Tangua nodded, just once, his gaze returning to the flames. "But you fought," he said. "For them." He nodded toward the twins, their tiny fists curled in sleep. "That's not nothing." The words landed like a stone in her chest, stirring something she hadn't felt in years, pride, maybe, or purpose. She looked at her sons, their faces flushed with life, and felt a flicker of strength. "Nawi," she said, testing the name Tangua had given the stronger boy. "Swano," she added, for the weaker one, her voice soft but sure. Tangua's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Good names," he said. "They'll carry them well." The moment felt like a bridge, shaky but real, spanning the chasm between their worlds. Eliza's eyes drifted to the rifle by her side, then to Tangua's bow, leaning against the wall. "If you're enjoying this tale of survival and unlikely bonds," she thought, as if speaking to an unseen listener, join us at Wild West Love Stories. Subscribe to hear how scars can build something stronger than hate. Share where you're listening from. It's a story worth spreading. The thought faded, her focus returning to the shack, where the fire's warmth held them together, if only for now. Outside, the wind slowed, the storm's rage easing into a low moan. Tangua stood, slinging his bow over his shoulder. "Rest," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. "Tomorrow we move. This place won't hold forever." Eliza nodded, her hands tightening around her sons. "Where to?" she asked, fear and trust warring in her chest. Tangua's eyes met hers, steady as the earth. "Somewhere safe," he said. "For them." He stepped toward the door, pausing to glance back, his silhouette framed by the dawn's faint glow. The shack felt less like a prison now, more like a crossroads, where two broken paths had begun to converge. The shack felt less like a prison now, more like a crossroads, where two broken paths had begun to converge. Tangua's promise of safety lingered as he stepped into the dawn, leaving Eliza with her twins and the fragile hope of a new day in 1875 Wyoming. The wind had stilled, but the air carried a chill that sank into her bones. She cradled Nawi and Swano, their warmth her only anchor, as the shack's timbers groaned under the weight of a world that felt too heavy to bear. The fire burned low, its embers a faint pulse in the dimness, and Eliza's eyes traced the walls, half expecting the outlaws or rangers to come crashing through. Days passed in a blur of survival. Tangua returned each dusk, his boots crusted with snow, bringing strips of dried meat or roots boiled into bitter tea. He spoke little, his silence a language of its own, but his presence steadied her. Eliza's strength grew, her wounds scabbing over, though her ribs ached with every breath. The twins thrived, their cries louder, their tiny fists grasping at her fingers. But on the fifth night, as a storm growled outside, Nawi's cries turned weak, his skin burning hot under her touch, his small body twisted, red blotches blooming across his cheeks, eyes glazed with fever. Eliza's heart seized. She pressed her hand to his forehead, the heat like a branding iron. "No," she whispered, rocking him against her chest. "You don't get to leave me." Swano whimpered nearby, sensing his brother's distress, but he was cool to the touch, unharmed. Eliza's fingers shook as she dribbled water from Tangua's skin onto Nawi's lips, but he barely swallowed, his breaths shallow and ragged. The shack's wall seemed to close in, the fire's light mocking her helplessness. She sang broken lullabies, her voice cracking, the words half-remembered from a childhood that offered no comfort. Tangua entered, his coat dripping from the storm, his eyes narrowing as he saw Nawi's flushed face. He knelt beside them, his fingers brushing the boy's cheek, then his brow. "This isn't a common fever," he said, his voice low, urgent, like a man who'd seen death too often. Eliza's eyes burned, tears spilling over. "He's dying, isn't he?" she choked out, clutching Nawi tighter. Tangua didn't answer, his silence heavier than words. He stood, pulling a leather satchel from his belt, his movements swift but deliberate. "There's a tribe 2 days' ride," he said. "Their healer knows roots that break fever. I'll go." Eliza grabbed his wrist, her grip fierce despite her trembling. "They'll kill you," she said, her voice sharp with fear. "You said they don't trust Comanche from here." Tangua's eyes met hers, steady as stone. "I've faced worse," he said, pulling free with care. He slung his bow over his shoulder, his knife glinting at his hip, and stepped into the storm without looking back. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in Eliza's chest. The next 2 nights were a torment. Nawi's fever climbed, his cries fading to whimpers, his body limp in her arms. Eliza didn't eat, didn't sleep, her world narrowing to the rise and fall of his tiny chest. She knelt in the snow outside, the storm drowning her sobs, begging the sky to take her instead. "He's all I've got," she whispered, her voice lost in the wind. Swano slept fitfully, his brother's absence a quiet ache. The fire sputtered, its warmth no match for the cold fear gripping her. At dawn on the 3rd day, a shout broke the silence. Tangua's horse stumbled into the clearing, foam at its mouth, its rider slumped forward. Eliza ran, her bare feet numb in the snow, as Tangua slid from the saddle, blood staining his torn shirt, a gash across his arm. He thrust a leather pouch into her hands, his voice hoarse. "Boil this, fast." Inside were dark, twisted roots, their scent sharp as pine. Eliza rushed to the hearth, throwing them into a pot, the water hissing as it boiled. She fed Nawi the bitter broth, spoon by trembling spoon, her prayers a silent drumbeat. Hours crawled by, then a day. Nawi's fever broke at dusk, his skin cooling, his breath steadying. Eliza wept, her forehead pressed to his, relief flooding her like a river after drought. Later, she found Tangua outside, wrapping his wound with a strip of hide. The gash was long but shallow, likely from a blade. "You came back," she said, her voice thick. He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Had to," he said, simple as truth. Eliza sat beside him, the snow soft under her, and for the first time, she felt not just saved, but seen. Eliza sat beside him, the snow soft under her, and for the first time, she felt not just saved, but seen. Tangua's quiet resolve, his bloodied arm wrapped in hide, anchored her against the fading storm. The Wyoming sky cleared, stars piercing the dusk like bullet holes, but the peace was a lie. In 1875, the wilderness held its breath, waiting for old wounds to bleed anew. Days turned to weeks in the fur trader's shack, Eliza's strength returning as Nawi and Swano grew, their cries now strong enough to echo off the timber walls. Tangua hunted, his bow bringing down rabbits and deer, his silence a steady presence. But the past, like a shadow, never strayed far. One evening, as the fire cast long fingers across the floor, a distant rumble broke the quiet. Hooves, too many, too fast. Tangua was at the door in an instant, his knife drawn, eyes scanning the ridge. Eliza clutched the twins, her heart pounding like a war drum. "Stay inside," Tangua hissed, slipping into the twilight, his form blending with the pines. She grabbed the rifle, its weight familiar now, and peered through a crack in the wall. 5 riders emerged, their dusters flapping like vultures' wings, faces half hidden by hats. The leader dismounted, his grin sharp as a blade, and Eliza's blood ran cold. It was him, her husband, Caleb, the coward who'd left her to die. "We know you're here, Eliza," Caleb called, his voice oily, cutting through the dusk. "Got your brats too, I reckon? Hand 'em over, and we might let you walk." His men laughed, their rifles glinting in the fading light. Eliza's hands shook, but she tightened her grip on the gun, her son's warmth against her chest, fueling her resolve. Tangua appeared from the shadows, bowstring taut, an arrow trained on Caleb's chest. "Leave," he said, his voice low, deadly as a rattlesnake's rattle, "or you're carrion." Caleb's grin widened, unfazed. "A Comanche playing hero? You're out of your depth, boy. She's ours, her and the kids. Gotta keep her quiet about our business." His men fanned out, boots crunching on the frozen earth, fingers itching on triggers. Eliza's breath hitched. She knew Caleb's cruelty, how he'd sold her trust for a cut of stolen gold, how he'd laughed as she bled in the snow. She stepped to the door, rifle raised, her voice steady despite the fear clawing her gut. "You don't own me, Caleb. Not anymore." The air snapped tight, like a rope about to break. Caleb's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching toward his pistol. "You'll regret that, girl," he sneered, stepping forward. Tangua loosed an arrow, grazing Caleb's shoulder, pinning his duster to a tree. The outlaw cursed, yanking free, and his men opened fire, bullets splintering the shack's walls. Eliza ducked, shielding the twins, their cries piercing the chaos. Tangua rolled behind a stump, his arrows flying, one finding a man's thigh, another his chest. 2 down, but the others pressed closer, their gunfire a relentless storm. Eliza's hands trembled, the rifle heavy as she aimed through the doorway. Her first shot went wide, kicking up dirt. The second grazed a man's arm, but Caleb was on her, his shadow looming as he kicked the door in. "Stupid whore," he snarled, lunging for Swano. Eliza's vision tunneled, her fear burning into rage. She swung the rifle's butt, cracking it against his jaw. He staggered, but grabbed her arm, twisting hard. Nawi wailed, and something primal snapped in her. She yanked free, raised the rifle, and fired point blank. Caleb's eyes widened, blood blooming across his chest as he fell, his grin gone forever. Tangua dispatched the last 2 outlaws, his knife flashing in the moonlight, but a bullet had found his side, blood soaking his shirt. He stumbled, catching himself against the shack. Eliza dropped the rifle, rushing to him, her hands pressing against the wound. "Stay with me," she said, her voice raw, the twins crying behind her. Tangua's breath was ragged, but his eyes held hers, steady despite the pain. "Had to," he rasped, echoing his words from before. The ridge was silent now, the outlaws' bodies still in the snow, the air thick with gun smoke and blood. Eliza tore a strip from her skirt, binding Tangua's wound, her hand steady despite her racing heart. The twins' cries softened, their warmth a reminder of what she'd fought for. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice low, but I owe you a home." Tangua's hand brushed hers, weak but deliberate. "Not debt," he said, his voice faint but clear. "Choice." The moonlight bathed them, the shack standing defiant against the night, and Eliza knew they'd faced the past and won. Not with bullets, but with something stronger. The moonlight bathed them, the shack standing defiant against the night, and Eliza knew they'd faced the past and won. Not with bullets, but with something stronger. Tangua's hand, weak but steady, lingered on hers, his blood seeping through the makeshift bandage as the Wyoming stars burned cold above. The air reeked of gun smoke, but the silence that followed was heavier, a quiet forged in survival. Spring crept into 1875, the snow melting into rivulets that carved the earth like veins. The shack, battered but unyielding, could no longer hold them. Eliza and Tangua, bound by choices made in blood, set out for a new beginning. They moved west at dawn, Tangua's wound slowing his steps, his face tight with pain he wouldn't voice. Eliza carried Nawi and Swano in a sling of softened hide, her ribs still aching, but her resolve ironclad. The plains stretched wide, grass whispering under a sky the color of flint. Tangua led them to a sheltered valley, where a creek murmured and cedars stood like sentinels. Here, he said, they could build something, not just shelter, but a life. Eliza nodded, her eyes tracing the horizon, seeing not just escape, but a place to stay. They worked side by side, Tangua's hands, scarred and sure, shaping cedar posts, while Eliza wove grass mats to line the earth. The shelter rose slowly, its frame of bone and hide sturdy against the wind. Nawi and Swano slept in a cradle of furs, their gurgles a soft counterpoint to the hammer's rhythm. Eliza watched Tangua drive a post into the ground, sweat beading on his brow, his wound bandaged, but still raw. "You don't stop," she said, her voice low, almost lost in the breeze. He glanced at her, his eyes like polished stone. "Neither do you," he said, and kept working. The valley was alive with the hum of spring, wildflowers dotting the grass, the creek's song mingling with birdsong. But danger lingered, a shadow on the ridge. Tangua's bow never strayed far, and Eliza kept the rifle close, its weight a reminder of the blood she'd spilled. One evening, as the sun bled red across the hills, they sat by a small fire, sharing a pot of stew made from rabbit and wild onions. The twins slept nearby, their breaths steady. Eliza's fingers brushed Tangua's as she passed the bowl, a fleeting touch that carried the weight of unspoken vows. "You could have left," she said, staring into the flames. "After the fight. Why stay?" Tangua's gaze settled on the twins, then on her, his scar catching the firelight. "I walked away once," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "From a woman begging for help. Her face never left me. I won't carry another." Eliza's throat tightened, her own ghosts stirring. Her father's back as he walked out, her husband's laugh as he rode away. "I thought surviving meant running," she said. "Now I think it's choosing where to stand." Tangua nodded, his hand resting near hers, not touching, but close. "You chose them," he said, glancing at the twins. "That's enough." The fire crackled, its warmth a quiet promise. Eliza looked at him, seeing not just a warrior, but a man who'd built a shelter with the same hands that had killed for her. "And you chose us," she said, her voice steady. "That's more than enough. No priest would come to this valley, no paper would bind them. But as the stars blinked awake, they shared a moment that needed no witness." Eliza leaned against the shelter's frame, Tangua beside her, their shoulders brushing as the creek sang softly. The twins stirred, Nawi's tiny hand reaching for Swano's, and Eliza felt a warmth deeper than the fire. It wasn't love as the storybooks told it. No grand gestures, no flowery words. But it was real, built from shared stew, shared scars, shared choices. The shelter stood complete by week's end, its hide walls taut, its earth floor smooth. Eliza laid the twins inside, their cradle bathed in the golden light filtering through the seams. She stepped outside, where Tangwa sharpened arrows, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the ridge. "This is it," she said, her voice soft as the grass. "A home." He looked at her, his face unreadable, but his eyes soft. "For now," he said, and she understood. Danger would come, as it always did in this land, but they'd face it together. The valley held them, a fragile haven, and in its quiet, they became a family, not by blood, but by the choice to stand as one. The valley held them, a fragile haven, and in its quiet, they became a family, not by blood, but by the choice to stand as one. The Wyoming summer of 1875 unfurled like a banner, the grass high and golden, swaying under a sky vast as hope itself. Eliza stood in the meadow beyond their shelter, Naui on her hip, Swano chewing her shawl, their eyes wide with the world's newness. Tangwa worked nearby, his hand steady as he smoothed the final stones around their fire pit, the hide walls of their home taut against the morning breeze. The air smelled of sage and earth, a promise of something enduring, though the shadow of danger lingered like dust on the horizon. The shelter was no grand homestead, but it was theirs, cedar and bone, built with sweat and silence. Eliza watched Tangwa, his scar catching the sunlight, his movements deliberate despite the wound that still pained him. She'd learned his rhythms, the way he scanned the ridge at dawn, his bow always within reach. They'd buried the past, but the land didn't forget. Hoofbeats echoed faintly one morning, not the reckless charge of outlaws, but slow, cautious. 3 riders appeared, their faces gaunt, bandages stained with blood. White men, not soldiers, but drifters, their horses lean as their hopes. Tangwa's hand tightened on his knife, his eyes narrowing. Eliza stepped forward, the twins in her arms, her voice steady. "They're hurt," she said, meeting his gaze. "Let me talk." He hesitated, then nodded, his trust in her a quiet weight. She approached the riders, rifle slung across her back, its presence a reminder of what she'd become. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone sharp but not cruel. The oldest, his arm in a sling, tipped his hat with trembling fingers. "Ambushed south of here," he rasped. "Bandits. Lost our gear. Heard there are healers in these parts." Eliza studied them, their eyes hollow but not deceitful. She turned to Tangwa, who stood like a sentinel, his bow lowered but ready. "Let them rest," she said. "We can help." His jaw tightened, memories of burned camps flickering in his eyes. But he looked at the twins, then at the valley they'd claimed. "For one night," he said, his voice low. The drifters wept with relief as Eliza brought water, Tangwa fetching herbs from a cache he'd hidden in the cedars. The camp stirred, uneasy but obedient, as the strangers slept under borrowed hides. That evening, a Comanche woman approached, her braids long, her face lined like a riverbed. She carried Swano, who gurgled at her necklace. "You'd trust too easily," she said, her voice soft but probing. Eliza met her gaze, unflinching. "I trust what I see," she said, "not what fear tells me." The woman's lips parted, a faint smile breaking through. "He's not afraid," she said, nodding at Swano. "Because hate's taught, not born," Eliza replied. The woman handed her the child, her touch lingering, a bridge built in silence. As night fell, the fire crackled low, the valley alive with the hum of crickets and the creek's soft song. Eliza joined Tangwa at the camp's edge, where stars blanketed the sky. "You let them in," she said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "I know what that cost." Tangua's eyes softened, his hand grazing her arm, a question answered without words. "Thought protecting meant keeping all out," he said, his voice rough as the earth. "Now I think it's choosing what to keep." The twins slept in their cradle, the shelter's walls glowing faintly in the firelight. Eliza leaned into Tangua's touch, her voice barely above the wind. "I used to run from pain, from loss. Now I've found something to stay for." His hand found hers, strong and scarred, and they stood together, the valley cradling them like a promise. The land was harsh, its dangers ever present, but it was theirs. Coyotes howled in the distance, their calls a reminder of the wild's claim, but Eliza and Tangua no longer feared it. Morning broke, the sun painting the hills gold. The drifters left, their wounds bound, their gratitude quiet, but real. Eliza stood with Nawi and Swano, watching Tangua sharpen his arrows, his eyes on the ridge. "This is enough," she said, her voice soft as the grass. He looked at her, his face steady, his heart laid bare in a single nod. "Enough," he echoed, and they turned to their home, where the dawn promised not just survival, but a life chosen together, fierce and unbroken. The tale of Eliza and Tangua, forged in the harsh Wyoming wilds of 1875, ends not with a sunset, but with a dawn, a family built on choice, not blood. Their story of survival and trust speaks to the heart of resilience. What did their journey stir in you? Share your thoughts on how love can bloom in the harshest lands. Your voice matters. We're grateful for your time, for riding alongside us through this saga of scars and strength. Join us again at Wild West Love Stories for more tales where hearts hold stronger than bullets. Until then, keep the fire of these stories burning. We'll meet you at the next horizon.